little over a month ago, I uploaded a video called We Call Them Boogers in the South. It's a story I recorded 6 or 7 years ago. The man speaking, his name is Jim Bear King. Some of you who follow the Bigfoot topic know who he is. But I met him about 7 years ago, and I asked him if I could mic him up and record some of his stories. Had no idea what I was going to do with those recordings at the moment, but he agreed. I taped him. I've had those recordings all this time, and I just stumbled back across them a couple of months ago, brought them up, and now that I've learned to edit audio, I got them in a good enough shape that you can understand what he's saying. So these are great stories. This story is how his grandfather discovered that these boogers, or Bigfoot, lived on their property in Mississippi long before Jim was born. So this is a really good story. And then the second half of his recording is him going back to the explanation or the story he told about We Call Them Boogers in the South, that podcast. And he elaborates on what he saw. And it's just some good stuff, so I hope you all enjoy it. All right, here we go.
That's when my grandfather said, come clean with me and my brother about him and his boogers. And that's when he even told us while he was courting my grandmother. Only way he could visit with my mother was to ride through the woods on an old mule. It was always the old mule.
So he wasn't in a wagon, he was on the mule?
He was on the mule.
No saddle?
No saddle. Just a halter and a bridle. What he'd do, he worked every day. He quit school when he was in the 8th grade because he had to work. His father had died of a heart attack when he was young, so it was him and his younger brothers and his 2 sisters, and so he had to quit school, and actually he was the one planting the cotton, picking the cotton, running the farm, the whole 9 yards. He met my grandmother at an old camp revival meeting. I don't know what it was. It was a tent revival meeting. And they started courting each other. It wasn't dating, it's courting. The only way he could visit her was only on his day off. And back in those days, you did not work on Sunday. That was the day that, you rested. So what he would do would leave the house early Sunday morning. He'd go out there and he'd grab one of the most gentler disposition mule he had. It was so easily dispositioned that he knew that it wouldn't go crazy on him while he was running through the fields. So he goes and he gets his old mule. He gets on his old mule and he put a halter on it and take off bareback through the woods over 3 big hollows. As a crow flies through there, it was probably about 5 miles. So that's how important it was to him to see my grandmother. Well, back in those days, they didn't have a vehicle, so they didn't go to the movie show, and they didn't do all that kind of mess. Best way he could do to see her was to go to church with her. That was the only way my grandmother's father would allow them to court, I guess you'd call it.
So he would only see her on Sundays?
Only Sundays. Well, during church and after church. Because he knew my grandfather was a Methodist. My grandmother was I'll call it a Calvinite. They was Church of Christ.
Campbellite?
Yeah, Campbellite. I'd say Church of Christ, but yeah. But anyhow, he would get up early that morning. He would halter up the old mule with reins. He'd take out way before daylight. It took him to ride that old mule, cutting through the country, not on the roads, about an hour and a half, 2 hours to get to my grandmama. But what he would do, he would meet them at the local church. And he would go through the church services with my grandmama. And then, of course, back in those days on Sundays when you'd go out there and wring the neck off the chicken and you had all your vegetables, and that was the day that you all sit down and ate together and sit on the front porch after you get through eating and just talk and chill and spit and whatever was going on. Well, he told me that he wasn't plowing, but he was picking cotton, and he'd been busy, and they had a decent crop that year, and he was putting in long hours that week, and he was tired. And my grandmama just let him fall asleep on that little swing on the front porch, and she forgot to wake him up when he asked her to wake him up, because he had to ride back through those woods to get home. I'm thinking this was probably October, because even back in those days, they did not have what people would understand as defoliation. You had to naturally let the cotton come out on its own, you know what I mean? So when he woke him up, time had got past them. They did their configuring and knew that he'd be riding through those woods in the dark. Well, my great-grandfather, which he wasn't my great-grandfather at the time, had just bought one of those carbine lights to use for coon hunting. And what these lights did, they didn't work on no real battery system, but it was in big batteries. You know what I'm talking about? It had a glass globe, brand new. But my grandfather had been courting my grandmama now all summer long after they met at that tent revival meeting, probably in July. So here he goes on his old trusty mule that wouldn't run or nothing. He said you couldn't make that rascal run. He said you could kick him in the ribs forever and he wouldn't. He's going to go his own damn pace. So here he goes, getting on his old mule, heading through the woods in the dark. See the old house I lived in. They crossed the first hollow, kind of get over the hill into it, and get to the crest of the second hollow. By this time it's dark. He cuts on the carbine light, starts using it. Of course, the mule had done made this trip several times, and he knew where the house was. Wasn't no real defined path through the woods, but he knew where he was going. And it was a good thing he was. They got to the second hollow before it went down into a big hollow where it had a huge little creek down there. And the mule had to jump the creek every time he went across that creek. But before they got to that creek, the mule started acting fidgety. My granddaddy didn't know what it was about. He just thought, well, there's a wildcat or a panther or something in the area because the mule's smelling. So I'll be okay. He tries to get the mule to keep heading in the direction he's going, but the mule didn't really want to go. But he knew that was the only way he could go to get home. So he was steadily prodding him and kicking the old mule to make him go on. Well, the mule finally went on the way my granddaddy wanted him to go. About that time, they get to almost to that top of that ridge, and the mule just stops. He balks. My granddaddy was just steadily kicking that old mule in the ribs. The mule was snorting and blowing, and his old ears was doing this, and he's turning his head kind of, you know how mules are. And my granddaddy just steadily kicking him in the ribs as hard as he could to get that son of a bitch to go. Mule just stopped. About that time, something starts rustling in the bushes over here behind my granddaddy to his right. And then he said something about hearing a tree snap and whatever, and all of a sudden something lets out this ungodly scream. He never heard it in his life. And he looks back and he sees this thing. All he does is gets a glimpse of it. And when this thing screams, that mule takes out like he's running in the Kentucky Derby. My grandfather didn't have no saddle, so all he did was grab the reins and just locked his knees as hard as he could into the chest of that mule and hung on for dear life. He said that mule cleared that ditch in one leap which he would always gingerly go up and down that ridge to try to get across that creek. That rascal did not stop until he saw the house, and he kept running. Papa said they had one of them open barns where he runs in. He said that the mule run into the barn and did not lock his hooves until he almost hit the back wall. Well, when he locked his brakes, my grandfather, not having a saddle or nothing, kept going and hit the wall on the backside and shattered my great-great-granddaddy's brand new carbine light. That's the first time my grandfather had a run-in with a booger. He told some folks about it, and the people that he talked to, because back in those days, there wasn't no reporters or no TV or no nothing. It was just local people, and they all coon hunted or deer hunted or trapped or whatever. And he talking to some of his moonshine buddies, and that's when they said, "Oh, you run into a booger." And that's when they started telling him about what a booger is. That's when he, some of them call it the wild man of the woods. Looks like a human, but looks like a monkey or an ape. And that was his first run-in with what is known to a booger, for him to explain it to me and my brother. Then he come clean and he said, yes, these things are on the back of that hill up there. That's when I brought up the big monkey in the backyard one night, and my brother remembered it too.
That's when you told him about it.
That's when I told him about the one that was draped over, and Papa just slowly said, he said, yes. He said, I believe that's what you saw that night. There was my confirmation.
It all came full circle.
Quick. Yeah. Now, getting back to the other, I seen this thing in the face. This was a young one. He wasn't a full-blown one.
The lightning bug?
Yeah, the lightning bug incident. He wasn't nothing as big as the one that was draped over the fence in the backyard when I was 6 years old. That was a bigger one. This one's arms wasn't as long as that one. Let's put it that way. And I was able to see the arms very well. I could see the muscle definition and everything. He didn't have a regular gait. It was like a lope. And it always led with his left arm when it was loping toward me and my sister. I noticed when I seen the big son of a bitch that a full-blown alpha male gets bigger than a gorilla. One I seen after comparing it, but I was able to recognize that this was a younger one. I would guesstimate that he was probably about 7-8 years our age, but in their development, they're a lot larger than that. They start breeding when they're anywhere from 8 to 9 to 10 years of age. But see, all that's hard to believe because we didn't have a zoo. This thing looked like it had the mange. Remember, it's in the spring of the year. This thing don't have fur, it has hair, just like me and you. Hair. It grows. I've learned that over the years. It's not fur, it's hair. It had mangy looking spots in its crease of its elbow, not on the backside, never seen the backside of his elbow. This thing was loping toward us home, and it was knuckle walking. It was not placing its hands flat on the ground. It was knuckle walking just like a chimpanzee. Because this thing was coming directly at us, and I was able to note that and see it. It had a more rounded head. It was not no pointed head. Cone shape happens with maturity, sexual maturity. This one did not have a cone-shaped head. He had spots on its chest that looked like he'd done tore clumps out. And
bald spots.
Yeah, bald spots. The skin tone under the hair was a grayish black looking. The color of the hair was more like, I call it maroon, but it ain't maroon, it ain't red. It's kind of between that, kind of blondish type red, if that makes sense.
Okay, I'm thinking black in my mind.
No, the skin underneath the hair was more grayish black. This thing, my grandfather, when it stood up bipedally, my grandfather guesstimated it was 6.5 to 7 foot tall. Up to then, we didn't know how big it was. I know that when it was loping across there, it was a little bit about the size of a Shetland pony. Small. When that sucker stood up, that's when I can see it had mangy spots on its knees. But I also said something else. It never locked its knees like it's standing up like me and you can. They can't. It had kind of a little angle to them. When it stood up, you got to imagine when it's on all fours, its heels never touch the ground. It's walking on the front pad of its foot. That section where...
Yeah, from the ball.
Yeah, like a woman in high heel shoes. When it stood up, I could tell most of its weight. Yes, its heel was touching the ground, but the way its knee was angled put most of the weight on the front part of the foot. When it turned its back to walk into the woods, we only got it at an angle. We was looking at the angle, and its shoulders, it looked like a linebacker with shoulder pads. But its neck was so taut, it could not turn its neck to look back at us without shifting the top half of its body toward us too, which made it kind of walk like this.
Right.
I noticed that it could not physically turn around and do that. The hair on its back started draping from its shoulders downward to a V to its butt crack. That makes, everybody says it looks like they have a long flowing mane. Or you remember that?
Yeah, but it's got hair on the rest of its torso. It just thins out there, right? Okay.
Yeah, it do.
Into the woods, it wasn't running away.
Nope. Walked looking back at us, never took its eyes off of. Actually, I'm thinking it never took its eyes off my granddaddy.
You know what's interesting is that Patterson Gimlin film?
Yeah.
When that thing turns, it turns its whole torso.
Thank you.
I mean, and it lets its arms
Thank you.
help it turn, you know?
Yep.
It does this.
Yes.
It turns, his whole torso turns.
Yep. It did. I could not.
I'm looking back at something, I'm just going to turn my head.
I could not physically to this day note in my mind. Out of all the ones I've seen, this is what gets me. I cannot recollect ears that much because of the hair on its head.
It's probably got small ears.
I'm thinking so too. I don't know that for a fact. That rascal, like I said, the first expression I got because of seeing something that close, I was scared to death. But then, after I thought about it over the years, watched the emotions on its face. It had hair, it had a beard, it didn't have a mustache, it was kind of under here, was open. It had a kind of a pronounced brow ridge, but it wasn't much. But it was more oval-shaped head. It wasn't no sagittal crest. But then the emotion I could see in its eyes was nothing dangerous. After I thought about it, it acted like it wanted to play with me, my brother and sister. And I think what lured him to us was our high-pitched voices as children, screaming and playing and yelling, and it's that time of the day when they start actively moving because they start feeding around dark. And hearing all of our squealing, because sound carries in the country, you know this, it carries farther than people realize. You know, you can hear your neighbor if the wind's blowing right half a mile, or not a half mile, but about a quarter of a mile away, and hear their TV. Well, this thing heard us squealing and playing and probably was watching us and just couldn't resist it. And it wanted to have fun too. But when my grandfather walked into its eye frame, the whole expression changed and it stood up on two legs.
So do you think their hair color is different, the same, or
nope, different?
Just like humans' hair color is different.
And their skin color pigmentation underneath the hair is different. We'll get into all of that eventually.
Okay, that's the end of that recording. I apologize that it ended so abruptly, but again, when I was recording these, I had no idea what I was going to do with them. So, and I just found them, and they're recently, and they're just, Jim is such a good storyteller that it's hard not to share this with you all. He's agreed to let me do that. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I think I've got 2 more stories recorded, and if we get a chance, he and I are going to get together again. I'm going to stick a mic on him that has a little better recording quality and get some more of his stories. I just love to hear him talk. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. So with that being said, we'll see you guys on the next podcast. Thank you.